Hello my friends, and welcome to the first episode of FISHTORY in a while. Now, when I say the episode of FISHTORY exclamation point, I mean the audio-based episodes that we used to have here regularly, where we try to keep it 5 to 10 minutes long and audio-based. So you can do your water changes, you can drive to work, you can listen to this, whatever you're doing, and not have to look at the screen. I try to provide all the information for you right here. Now, members get extra episodes, and there's over 200 if you want to support the channel for just $1.99 a month. However, this is going to be the first of several episodes this month that are going to be open to everyone, just to kind of reinvigorate the series. So, here we are today talking about herring. Yes, herring are a sardine-like fish, a fish that, depending on the species, can be anywhere from 6 inches all the way to around 15 inches, or a little over 1 foot, somewhere around 45 centimeters max, and usually more like 15 centimeters long. These fish, however, can live up to 20 years, and they are very, very rich in antioxidants, omega-3s, omega-6s, fatty acids, and all sorts of protein. Also, these fish are something that humans have relied on for thousands of years. In fact, it's how many of the people in the Arctic and subarctic regions of the world have been able to stay in one place, is the influx of these small fish. Now, you may think of these fish similar to sardines or minnows in that they don't get large, but they travel in massive groups. And when I say massive, these groups that are in the Baltic and in the North Atlantic and Arctic Oceans, they are able to travel in groups of billions of fish. Not only that, they have established routes for migration, and in the winter they will go south where it is warmer, and they can eat lots of zoo and phytoplankton in the water. When they give birth, their fish fry are very, very tiny. They're microscopic, and they need to eat very, very tiny food that's very high in nutrients. And only the subtropic to mid-temperature waters, temperate waters, are where they can find this type of food. And it's in the top layer of water and in the coastal waters as well. So these fish travel from the Arctic, which is full of larger plankton that they eat in the summer and spring months, as well as part of our autumn. And then the part of the coldest part of the year, they travel down and have their babies in the warmer water. Now, there are several different migration patterns, and it is around 3 to 4 years before herring become fully mature and can have the max number of eggs. It's around 2 or 3 years before herring are able to reproduce at all, which is kind of a long time for a little fish. And it is the case that once they reach maturity, they have more and more fish every year that they are mature, if they're a male. And if they're a female, they will have more and more fish up to around 12 years old, and then it goes off a decline as they are somewhere between 10 or 12 to 20 years old. In some cases, they can live 20 years. Now, there are different species, and 3 of which live in the Arctic and are used as a resource for food. Humans have kept track of this since Roman times. We have all sorts of Celtic accounts of when these fish would come through, and it was so thick that the water would ripple like movement, and that you could see for miles these fish moving through. And when something like an orca or a porpoise would come through chasing them for food, it would apparently part, and it looked like the land had formed with these fish, and it had parted, and the ocean would fill back in as they would make lines and trails through this. And there's accounts of people standing on cliffs looking down on it, saying that the water turned black with fish, and that it also sparkled with the silver of when they would turn sideways. So we are talking billions of fish that have fed humanity in Europe, as well as over in Japan and Siberia, over into the Bering Sea and Alaska, across to Greenland, and all sorts of different cultures have utilized this fish in particular for everything from oil for lamps and burning, to bones for fine tools and needlework, for making beads and fabric and clothing, all the way to obviously drying them out and making all sorts of different food that will hold over the winter and can either be dried out or combined with berries or various other things, and is a major staple of many different cultures for many of years. So it is the Viking sagas that we learn of these fish, and that they actually were known to have groups traveling together by the billions. So these fish would blacken the sea, and they would travel all the way up along Norway or Sweden into the fjords as well, and they would break apart and they would all feed in smaller groups all throughout those summer months in the Arctic and subarctic region. Then they would get together off the coast again, and they would head 1,000 miles, 1,500 kilometers back down towards continental Europe, sort of off the shore of France and modern day UK, as well as Denmark and into the Baltic, depending on the species. But they would move south. So everyone from the Icelandic people to the Irish people to the French people would rely on these fish. And as modern day technology improved, we had fishing ships with massive nets that could catch these fish by the millions, if not by the billions, with fleets of these ships. And while it is a major economic staple, it was recognized early on that we need to manage this, because if you harvest all the fish, there's none the next year, right? So it turns out that they had assumed that the largest fish, the males, should be harvested, and that the medium-sized fish would be reproductive age males that had not yet peaked, but by harvesting just the very largest size over a certain cutoff for each species, that would ensure that those fish had already spawned at least 1 or 2 years, thus ensuring the survival of the species, or so they thought. This same idea has been implemented with fish like cod, and it turns out that in the case of cod, usually they assume that the females need to be over a certain size, because the females mature, they have their babies, and then it's only the females that reach a certain size. And so when they're smaller, you shouldn't catch them because they're at the peak of their fertility and it hasn't started to drop off yet. And then when they get to that big size, that may be the peak of their fertility, but then it drops off within a year or two. So it's a safer bet, logically speaking, to harvest those fish because they've already spawned a few times, even if it wasn't at maximum output. Well, it turns out with herring that the numbers have been dropping off for the last 50 years in the Atlantic, the Baltic, and the Arctic. And they have been wondering, what exactly is going on. They've been trying to manage it. And all of a sudden in 2021, off the coast of Norway, these fish that, like clockwork, according to the Viking sagas, 1,200 years ago, there are accounts of this fish coming from the south, off the European coast, off Brittany and Normandy, headed all the way back up into the deep Arctic, under the ice even. And every year they would pass by, they would hang out, and like clockwork, they would be harvested in these different places, and as they move through narrow points in their migratory route. Even back then, 1,200 years ago, we have accounts both from 800 years ago and as far back as I said as 840 AD is one of the earliest accounts that we still have of these groups. And it was known that one of these groups headed out to sea, according to them, which actually ends up being somewhere south of Greenland, maybe Nova Scotia or somewhere off there, off the North American continent is where they are headed. There's another group that goes south towards the opening of the Mediterranean. There's another group that cuts through by Ireland. And then there is another group that hangs out off the continental coast by Brittany and in between the UK and continental Europe. And these groups were known, and there are billions of fish in each. And like I said, each culture has these long-standing records of them annually coming through and it being a major predictable food source and stock. So much so that, there's patterns in clothing, there's metal and jewelry and crown jewels that have herring, that have last names and heraldry all associated with this very high protein, very high calorie and high nutrient source of food. And in 2021, mysteriously, they just stopped. This ever-dwindling, massive billions of herring stops moving, and it just parks itself off the coast of Norway. Not all the way in the deep Arctic, not in the warm water, but halfway along its route. And people are wondering what is going on. Why did it stop? Well, it turns out that inside a fish, there is a little bone, and it's actually associated with these little hair or nerve-like structures that can read this little stone or bone called an otolith. And the otolith or otolith is basically the inner ear of a fish, and it is layered. Every year of the fish's life, it has minerals adding to it, and it, depending on its shape and how it's situated in a substance of liquid in the fish's inner ear, and how it's rubbing on the nerves to the north, to the south, up, down, whatever, it tells the fish things. And we've known for years that you could look at these little otoliths and you can cut them in half, and just like the rings on a tree stump or on a log, you can actually then count how old the fish is by the cycles and layers of nutrients in this little organ / bone. And it's believed for a long time that this keeps information, not just things like the nourishment that the fish was getting, but also things like spatial awareness. It's almost like a gyroscope for the fish. And more likely than not, it is probably also something that interacts with the Earth's magnetic field and or migration of these fish. And it's along with the lateral line on fish and other sensory input organs that they have, it probably keeps a detailed record of which way to go: north, south, east, west, up, down, into the deep water or into shallow water. And it is this, combined with some sort of mental map that is in the fish's neurology, that allows fish like salmon, like herring, like any creature that moves, to figure out where it is going on this journey of life. And some creatures, like homing pigeons, for instance, can actually be tossed out anywhere and they'll find their way back home, knowing internally from whatever organ or neurology may control that. It's still a mystery to some degree. They can actually follow the Earth's magnetic field and map it so much in their brain that they can get closer and closer to home and find their way home. Now, other senses probably help, salinity in the water, different smells, different foods, different chemicals, things like this. But regardless of all of that, the older fish was assumed that the older fish, had this, and that it was ingrained into them, and that there was a record of it in that organ, and that the younger fish would develop it as they're doing this journey with the older fish too. But it turns out that there is a cultural knowledge among fish, we're now learning. And if you wipe out all the old fish in a group of herring or cod or any number of these fish that migrate, it appears that it is not instinctually ingrained into the fish. And that makes sense. There are different routes for migrating. So some fish go, like I said, over towards Greenland, not as warm of water off that coast, off North America and South west of Greenland. Others are right off the coast of Europe, and again, not as warm of waters as they could be going or whatnot, but they've adapted to these different settings based on what that school and that group, that gene pool of fish has been doing for now thousands of years. With the weather patterns we've had, even though they're dynamic, these same schools have been documented going the same places for 1,200 years in the case of herring. And now they are stalled as never before, and we're scratching our heads. Well, it turns out that it's not inherent. They don't know where to go, and that they need to be taught by those older fish who learned from their elders where to go. Without this knowledge, they can't follow the path back. So it turns out that the otolith is not a map. It may be a gyroscope. It may help them orient. It may help have some sort of sensory input, but it is not the guide stone. It is not necessarily it is not the map. It is the compass, if that makes sense. And these fish are now stalled, and they're trying to figure out what to do because they can't survive at much higher than barely sustaining their population rates in this slightly cold, slightly warm water. It's as though the fish have parked there, and the larval fish don't get enough nutrients as they would get in the warm water they usually migrate to, and the adult fish are not then getting all that protein they need so that they can grow more eggs, and so the males can become mature, and so that they can make their migration back. And so they're parked in this state of limbo, and they have not moved now for several years. And scientists are trying to figure out, what do we do? Do we take one of the other groups of herring and try to collect a bunch of the adults, a bunch of the old males that are still left, and put them in this group, and hopefully they'll follow them to their spawning grounds, and maybe two groups will go to the same place? Or is there a way to restart this cycle? Will a weather shift, like a micro El Nino or La Nina, a warm current or a disruption in the jet streams, may that kind of shift things back into gear? But while this is going on, these fish only live a max of 15 to 20 years, and they're starting to die, and also they're being harvested still, and now quotas need to be scaled back because this massive group, the biggest group of herring in the world, is simply stalled. It's a very interesting situation, and it's teaching us a lot about fish, and the fact that fish have a cultural memory, a cultural knowledge that goes back thousands of years in some cases. And it's making us rethink how fish know where to go. It's also making us rethink how to manage fish populations and what exactly is going on. We used to think that harvesting the most mature, the largest fish, was a safe bet. But now it appears that they hold the safest, most sure knowledge of all the fish in the sea of their migration routes. So perhaps they're not safe to harvest. Perhaps the old methods from before the 1800s and 1700s, before steam power ships allowed for massive ocean trawling, perhaps harvesting a little bit of everything at a lower level of intensity is a better way to harvest these massive schools of schooling fish. Perhaps it's not best to only target the large ones with these specialized nets and traps. So we need to rethink all of this, and currently that's going on, as well as trying to figure out how and if we can save these incredible creatures that have provided a lifeline for Europeans and Arctic people all around the world for thousands of years. They very well may have been one of the main food sources that was reliable, along with seaweed, kelp, mussels, clams, and bivalves, for the first people to enter the Americas along the Bering Land Bridge, if they went that route. So this is really interesting stuff that is very tied to the history of humans. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of FISHTORY audio format, and let me know in the comments if you'd like more of this kind of stuff where it's not highly produced. If you do, I love it because I can put out more of this content and relay more educational information and fascinating stories to you all in the community without taking days to edit and produce. I appreciate it, and in the future, a lot of these will be for members only. So if you enjoy these FISHTORY episodes, the audio-based shorter episodes in theory, although this one ended up being just as long as any episode, you can support the channel for $1.99 and get access to an existing archive of already 214 episodes, last I counted, and whatever is coming out in the future. Thank you so much for being a part of the community, and thank you so much for being you and staying curious. I'll see you guys next time. I'll hopefully be the voice you hear next time on FISHTORY. Take care and have a great day. Bye.